Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for How to Recover from Ransomware. My name's James Watts. I'm here from Data Barracks. And so let's jump straight in. I want to kick off today's webinar with a bit of the standard housekeeping and the agenda for today. So first of all, the duration for this webinar is set to 30 minutes, so that will include some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you should have the section on the right-hand side of your screen to be able to pop those in. I won't be answering the questions as we work through. It's just myself here today, but I will make sure we've got time to take a look through all of them. And if there's anything that I don't have an answer for or that we don't get around to doing, I'll make sure we do get back to you individually. So in terms of the content today, I want to answer the first question that's usually asked, which is, will the slides be made available? And yes, we'll distribute the slides, both the slides and the recording of this webinar afterwards. So if there's anything that's particularly important you need to, don't feel you need to scribble it down now. And let's kick off. So there's three sections predominantly that we're going to be looking at today. So we have ransomware, and we're going to break this down to our 3 points here. So we have what it is and how it works. We have prevention and mitigation. And then we have the bulk of this, which is recovery. So let's start. I think it's important. Well, actually, do you know, before I jump into this, usually I would put this slide right at the end of a webinar, and I wanted to mention it now because I think it's particularly relevant to the topics we're talking about today. So we launched a podcast earlier this year called the BCPCAST, and so if you're interested in resilience and cybersecurity and recovery, you'll definitely be interested in this. It's a genuinely very interesting listen. It's not any folks from Data Barracks talking on this. It's all the guys who are real life continuity and security professionals from some big companies. So the guys like The Economist Group, BP, Fujitsu, London 2012 Olympics, and they're sharing their stories. Our most recent episode is this one you can see here on the left, We're All Human, We're All Vulnerable, which is about cybersecurity issues, but from a continuity perspective. So please take a look. The website is thebcpcast.com, or you can just download and subscribe within iTunes. So, ransomware. I don't want to go into too much detail about what it is in particular. I think there's plenty of other places you can go for that information. We've got a list of the resources at the end of this webinar, but it's very important when we're looking at how we can avoid it, recover from it, and mitigate it, that we have a basic understanding of what it is and what it does. So as a very broad definition, ransomware is malware that affects your system until you pay a ransom to be able to get access again. And there's two broad strands. There is the locker version of ransomware, which prevents you from being able to use the machine, but doesn't affect the underlying data. And there are crypto strands, which encrypt your data. And then you are unable to access those files until you pay the ransom. The ransom will buy you the encryption key, and then you can access the files again. The payment will usually be in the form of a cryptocurrency, something like Bitcoins. And the cost for the ransomware will vary. Starts at around $200, but it can be in the region of thousands of dollars, which we'll come on to in a second. The recent research from Trend Micro is suggesting that the actual the cost that you're likely to be paying is £540 per incident. I will say, in most cases that I'm personally aware of, where businesses have paid the ransom, they have received the encryption key and have received access to their data. But similarly, from that research from Trend Micro, they found that actually only in a fifth of cases do you actually get that data back. So there are no guarantees that paying the ransom will give you access to the data. And finally, the point that I want to mention here is the most common attack vector for a ransomware attack is currently through email, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot during this session. But it doesn't have to be. It's entirely possible for it to be deployed through malvertisements, compromised websites, or any of the other traditional methods for malware. So a couple of very important points to note that are just vital, I think, before we go any further. The first point is that the encryption is, to all intents and purposes, unbreakable. So the only guaranteed method we can't entirely trust paying the ransom is to have a backup copy of that data to be able to recover from. Secondly, there is a deadline for payment with the majority of these incidents. So what you will find is you will be given 24 or 72 hours to be able to act on this. So ultimately it's forcing your hand. It's not giving you the time to be able to plan or do anything else. What the attack wants is for you to simply say it is an easier process for me to pay this than risk losing that data. So who is being targeted and why is it so successful? Really the broader question here is, why has ransomware become such such an important part and such a big part of the recovery and the cybersecurity dialogue these days? And there are two factors. I think I'll start with the why. And there's a number of reasons, but the one that is overwhelmingly pushing this enormous surge that we're seeing is the rise of cryptocurrencies, which allow a cyber criminal to be able to take this ransom without being tracked. And what that's done is it's massively tipped the scales in terms of risk and reward. So whereas previously there was a high level of risk with these sorts of attacks because the criminal could be tracked through payment systems, that has become far, far lower. So we've seen the risk drop and the reward remain constant, which means a lot of folks are pushing this as a method for making money. And the people they're making the money from, so the who is being targeted, that's something that's changing too. So you will, in a successful cyber attack, again, we're looking at that risk and reward principle. One of the factors that determines whether someone is likely to pay a ransom is if they've got a good backup or not, if there's any way they could circumvent paying. And the type of people that generally don't have a good backup are consumers. It's as a business, we would assume and we would hope that we have a good backup system in place. So we see a strand of attacks going after the consumers, but equally, we're now seeing a surge towards businesses who have very high value data, but perhaps don't have the best prevention and security methods in place. So the two that come to mind immediately at the moment are both law firms and healthcare, which we're seeing an enormous amount in the US. So that's the why. So looking at how it works, so this is the screen. If you're lucky enough to not have suffered a ransomware attack to date, this is the message that you'll see on your screen that's blocked. But there's a lot that goes on before you reach this part, and so what I want to do quickly is do a quick run through each of these stages, because there are points within the attack where we can prevent it, we can mitigate it, and then ultimately how we recover. So the first stage is the installation. So ransomware has gone onto your system, be that through a phishing email. It's usually dropped into the app data or the temp folders in Windows, because a normal user will be able to write to these directories without any admin permissions. That installation then immediately needs to contact its command and control server. So this is where the encryption key will be created and passed off to the criminal. We have then a process of searching for the files that can be encrypted. We have the process of encryption, and then finally we have that ransom screen. So that first part that you will see, that's the end of this journey and where that's got to. But during each of these stages, there are some actions and some warning signs and some things that we can use to highlight where we are and see what we can do to prevent it. So the first thing that we should really be trying to do is to prevent staff clicking on that first email and downloading it and running the executable. So this is should be a pretty simple one, hopefully nothing new for anyone here. It's about having up-to-date anti-spam and anti-malware products. It's about disabling particular attachments. But ultimately, I think I hope we are all realizing it's none of these products are 100% foolproof. So you also need to pair that with a good education program internally. The best defense is to have well-educated staff who know what they're looking for, and importantly are reporting those phishing emails. So at the point of contact, so when this malware is communicating with its command and control server, if you have missed your chance to prevent the installation, you may have a chance to prevent any data loss here. So the encryption won't occur until that contact is made with the command and control server. If you're able to catch it here, again, you're preventing it. So this sounds like it should be a relatively simple procedure for a security product to be able to catch, but there's a number of reasons. There's a high number of these command and control servers which makes it difficult, and they're changing for the products to be able to catch them all the time. Often we will catch them. Those security products are updated, but in that interim window, a number of businesses will have been breached, and equally the ransomware products will use a DGA or a domain generation algorithm, which means there isn't a static list in the malware itself. It makes it harder for those products to be able to catch it. The encryption is an interesting point actually here. It is possible to flag ransomware at the encryption stage. You will ultimately, at this point, you will have some files that will be encrypted, and it's depending on how quick you're able to react. So there are anti-ransomware specific tools that can monitor and look for a high number of read and writes or file modifications if they're taking place. And then equally, there may be other network monitoring tools or products that you have that are looking for this sort of behavior, even if they're doing it for a different reason. So we as a backup service provider, for instance, we see this action usually for different reasons, but we can flag it as a cause of concern in ransomware. If you have, for instance, an incremental backup set that is a terabyte in size total, and the incremental change averages perhaps between 10 and 30 gigabytes a day, if suddenly you see it trying to push 500 gigabytes worth of data or the entire set again, you'll notice that something is wrong there, and it can be a cause for you to catch that and try to prevent any further data loss. So moving from what it is and what it's doing to how we mitigate against it. So the thing that's really important here is to look at what's our process, how do we update this from what we were previously doing with malware to how we deal with this new threat that is far more ubiquitous and far more likely to happen to us. So this is the standard incident response plan from the SANS Institute, and that's preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and then your lessons learned. So your preparation is how you plan for it. Your lessons learned are what you do once you've been through this incident, and then the meat is those 4 stages in the middle. So preparation is having a written policy and communicating and educating your team. The ransomware can be brought onto your system by any user, so it's important that all users are educated to an extent. Your plan needs to take into account what you do based on that incident and at what level of severity. So obviously there are different levels of ransomware infection. The way that you would react to an infection of one laptop is very different to something that is network-wide, for instance. So this will also include how you communicate with the team and whether the entire crisis management team needs to be brought in to deal with this particular incident. At the identification stage, that's simply, this is something for the IT team. If you have a really good, educated workforce who your users are flagging things that look as if they could be ransomware, often hopefully they'll be sending more than is really ransomware, so that's a case of just checking, making sure you know what it is and how you should react, and then determining what level of action needs to take place. The containment process, this is really the important part in terms of having the seniority and the authorization within the team that is dealing with this incident to be able to isolate wherever that issue is. So if it's a particular laptop, again, it's a pretty simple thing to do. But if you need to isolate the entire network or sections of that network, you need to have the authority to be able to do that at short notice. Eradication means the restoration of the clean data from before the infection. The recovery process here is not what we talk about when we talk about backup and recovery. This is when you have recovered those servers and you're bringing it back online. So this is bringing the business back and functional. And then finally, the lessons learned. So something has gone wrong. What do you need to learn from it? And there are 3 key things that you need to learn, which we'll come on to in a second when you're dealing with any ransomware attack. So the structure and how you build your response, your incident response team and your crisis management team it'll really be dictated by a few factors, one of which is the size of you as an organization. I know from looking at the businesses who are listening in today, we have some who are very, very large and others who perhaps you have a one-man or one-woman IT function. And if that's the case, you're probably dealing with a lot of these issues yourself. If you're in a larger organization, you will likely have an incident response team who will escalate to a crisis management team. The very, very large businesses might have a specific security incident management team who will be dealing with a continuity incident management team. So I guess that's something that I would hope is already in place. And the important part is hopefully if you have multiple teams, making sure you're communicating where this crossover will be for what is becoming a very, very prominent threat. So onto the meat of what we're talking about today, so the final part, which is how do you actually recover from this? So there's two methods that businesses will use to protect their data. There is backup and there is disaster recovery. At this stage, if you've been infected, you have two primary objectives. You want to minimize your data loss and you want to limit your downtime. So of those two things, they're what we talk about in continuity is your recovery point and your recovery time objective, or your RTO or your RPO. So recovery point objective is tied to how frequently you are backing up or replicating your data, and your recovery time objective, that just means how long does it take when you're kicking off that recovery to get the server back up and running. Now, the problem with disaster recovery for recovering from ransomware is that it generally isn't optimized for these sorts of cyber threats. Usually what you will do is, if you have that issue on your production system, you're immediately replicating that across to your disaster recovery, to your replica. Now, it is possible using DR services to go back through previous snapshots or through replication journals, but usually those products aren't wildly effective at managing data on the disaster recovery side. So usually businesses will limit the number of versions they'll be rolling back to on that, which means predominantly you're using backup for your method for recovery from ransomware. Now this will definitely save you, but there's two primary issues with what you need to do for recovery. Now the first is on your recovery point objective here. So with a replication or a disaster recovery service, you are likely replicating in very short intervals. You could be doing this with 15-minute intervals. With backup, most businesses will probably be doing that far less frequently, potentially once per day, which means you have a lot more data to lose in that instance. Also, in terms of the time for recovery, so the RTO, it's usually significantly longer from a backup service than it is from a disaster recovery service. You're looking at probably the region of hours versus the region of minutes for that recovery, which may be acceptable. If it's not, then that's something that needs to be addressed. So of those issues, how do you improve all of those things? So in terms of recovery point objective issue, there's a couple of easy, quick fixes that you can do here. The first is that you want to increase the frequency of the backups that you're taking. So we know this, so as a backup service provider, DataBarracks, we have products that will run in continuous data protection. So that is running file data backup in real time, and that's something that's common to a number of different backup products. So that's certainly something you can enable. If you are doing that as you would with an online backup service where you're running over the WAN, the only real consideration you should have here is what effect does that have on your bandwidth? It can increase the reliance on bandwidth for backup during the day. Otherwise, the only consideration is your network if it's something that's going on premise. So that's a simple way to reduce your recovery point objective. Now, the other issue you have is ransomware can actually be present on your systems for a length of time before you get that warning screen that tells you you now need to pay the ransom to get access to the data. Now we've seen examples of this where it's been on the network for a number of weeks before that alert actually happens. And in fact, there are strands of ransomware that are deliberately designed to not activate until a period of time has passed, to hopefully be longer than a standard business's retention policy. So you have at that point you would have no option but to pay because you do not have a backup. So you've got to make sure you have a number of versions. The other key point to add here is if you have, usually on a backup side, you'll have a number of frequent backups. So perhaps you're backing up, you're keeping in your retention policy any number of daily copies, but beyond that time, you may be reverting to a weekend backup, a month-end backup, or a quarterly backup. So something to review here in your retention policy is if you go beyond that 1 week point, at that stage, every backup you are going back to further is losing another week's worth of data. So worth knowing, worth looking at both of those points. On the recovery time objective side, there are some fairly standard things that you can do to improve your recovery speed. There's some things like throwing some resource at the server, performing the restore, looking at any bottlenecks and connection speeds, which are all good things and all should be done, and we'd certainly recommend doing so, because for a small amount of effort here, you get a big result on the recovery. But the main issue in terms of recovery time objective for a ransomware attack is the number of different recoveries that you will need to make to find a clean copy. So what often is in the case, if you have had an incident, the thing that you need to do is find out when that incident occurred, and then you want to find the first clean backup before then. Now, if it's not possible to do that through any other method, then the only way you can do this is to recover that server into a sandbox environment, to test it, to check it, to see if the ransomware is present, and if it is, then try another backup that is prior to that. Now, that part can be incredibly time intensive. So if you have a product that can check and find this, that can speed up. If not, there is a method that we have developed. So we'll run into that in just a second. So I want to run through this step-by-step plan of what that incident response is and how it works when you're recovering specifically here. So at the identification stage, IT needs to be notified by your users. You need to confirm the severity and enact the plan. So the containment stage, you're isolating the, whatever this is, so the share, the drive, the server, the entire network. The eradication, that's recovering that backup first in the sandbox environment, testing it, making sure it's clean. Then you're bringing that server back online. And again, at this point, you've tested it thoroughly in an isolated environment, but you should be vigilant. You want to make sure that this is clean and you're not further infecting anything else. And then at the lessons learned stage, so I've mentioned these points before, there's three key things that we'd say you want to be reviewing with the crisis management team post any infection. So how did the infection occur? Because that will tell you any steps that you need to take on the prevention side, whether it's looking at the products you're using for security or educating users. And then there's those 2 points that I mentioned on the backup and recovery side. So how much data did you lose, and how long was IT down for? Because those two things are the ones that, if they weren't sufficient, that's what you can then look to improve. So all of these steps that I've mentioned so far, these are general processes that you can go through. They will be applicable to different products, and they're predominantly these are methods that you can use to improve recovery using backup. But around 18 months ago, we were having a lot of conversations with customers who, when we would be fixing their backup retention policies and their backup schedules to improve this, and so actually this is good, but what we would like is to have the similar sort of recovery speed as we would get from a disaster recovery service. So you may have seen this. We launched a cyber disaster recovery service just in this summer, and so I want to run through quickly the method we use for that, because as I mentioned, it is possible to use disaster recovery to recover from ransomware attacks, but there's some subtle tweaks that we need to use. So I'll run through very quickly. This is the process of how this particular service works. So the replication works as standard. You're replicating those servers as you would normally do. This is a standard disaster recovery service. In this case, we're talking about a hypervisor level replication. All very normal at this point. What we then do is we do an automated recovery. So this is the recovery of a set of systems as you would do in a test, a standard test, or if you were recovering that system normally. But this is something that we automate to run every day. And at that point, we then do automated malware scanning. So what we're able to do is actually scan far more aggressively than you would necessarily be able to do on a production system, because we're doing this on a separate DR service, and this is something that I think a lot of people have talked about using. What are those other? What's the other value that you can get from disaster recovery services? What can you use those systems for? So scanning far more aggressively, and then reporting the success or failure of that scan back. So that then comes back. Now this all to this point is all nice and simple if there is no malware, but is obviously if we flag something and see that there is malware present on the system, we then need to look at how do we recover that system quickly and effectively. And this then works is that challenge we said of finding how do you get back to the most recent clean copy of your data so that you're minimizing any of the data loss. And we use recursive scanning at this point. So your scanning has been going on each day. We've got a report through of what's happened, and then you are notified at today of an infection. But as I said, the problem with a ransomware infection is it could well have been on the system for a number of days. The malware product may only have been updated today to find that particular signature. So it could be on your system for a number of hours. So what we then do is we kick off, again, an automated process to roll back, scan through those previous versions of data, check, see which is clean. If it is clean, it then scans forward to find the most recent version that is clean and recovers that system, and then you've got your system ready to go. If it doesn't find it at this point, it then scans all the way back again further. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize that time to find your clean version. And then ultimately you have a clean version, so you're recovering from disaster recovery. So you've got potentially a data loss of only a small number of hours, certainly the smallest number of hours that you would find before that infection, and you've got a recovery time objective that is very, very short. So we think this is probably the method that will offer the lowest data loss and the lowest time loss to the business. And so if anyone's interested in that, then do please drop us a line separately. That's something we can talk about. The final point I want to mention here is post recovery here is how do you actually test the process for recovery here? So our first suggestion would certainly be when you do your annual disaster recovery test, the next one that you've got coming up, make it cyber attacks, make it ransomware. It is a very prominent threat. We're in quite a privileged position as a backup and recovery company. We see these incidents when they get through to customers. So rather than the point of view as a perimeter protection that sees all of the potential threats that might get through, we see them when they do get through. And it has become, in the last probably 2 years, it has gone from being one of the least causes for significant recovery to by far the highest cause of significant recovery. So if you don't have time to do a full recovery, a full recovery test about ransomware, we would suggest you certainly should be doing some low-level testing, so some tabletop testing to see if your incident response plan would stand up. How does your disaster recovery plan work? How will you implement this for this particular type of attack? And we held the previous webinar on tabletop testing. If you want to take a look at that, it's on the resources section of our website. If you need any help with designing that, we actually built a tabletop test simulator, which again available on the website. Take a look in the tools section. And one of the particular disasters is a cyber attack, and it is ransomware. So it'll run through a number of those steps that you can take. So if you remember nothing else from today, I think I've probably banged on about it quite a lot, it's important to have a specific incident response plan for ransomware. It may not be something you have to date, but we're at a level now where you should anticipate a breach and you should have a response plan for it. Review your backup schedules and your retention policies. So looking at your RTOs and your RPOs, how do you minimize data loss and how do you minimize downtime to the business? And then finally, the only way that you can guarantee is that you don't, the only way you can guarantee that you don't lose data is that you have historic backup copies of your data, either in your backup or your DR systems. Now, we've finally got, here's the resources that I mentioned earlier today, so the podcast, the tabletop testing, and a handful of the resources on the incident response plan and some more of the detail on ransomware. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the session, so I'm always keen to make sure we stick to times. I know whenever I attend a webinar, I want to make sure that we start and finish at the right time. So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but I will endeavour to make sure we get back to people individually. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. So thanks all.